Today is Black Saturday in our Holy Week video series. As we've done each other day this week, we once again encourage you to take the time to teach your kids about this day to prepare your family for Resurrection Sunday. As this is our last video in our Holy Week video series, we must remember everything we learned throughout this week. So here's a recap. First, the people welcomed Jesus as king. He then kicked out the robbers of the temple, but the chief priests didn't like this attention that Jesus received, so they challenged him and made plans to put him to death. Judas Iscariot loved money more than God and was the one who betrayed Jesus to the chief priests. Then we learn that Jesus loved his disciples even unto death, and that ultimately it was God the Father who planned for Jesus' suffering and death to save his children. Today's question is, where was Jesus buried? The answer, in a new tomb. In Matthew 27, 57 through 66, we read that after Jesus' death on Friday, Joseph of Arimathea came to Pilate to ask for Jesus' body. Pilate agreed and gave Jesus' body to Joseph, who wrapped it in a clean linen shroud, and he laid it in a new tomb. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there watching where Joseph put him. But since it was the Sabbath the next day, the women could not prepare the body as they wanted to. Reading further, in Matthew 27, 63, the chief priests and Pharisees went to Pilate because they remembered that Jesus had claimed he would rise from the dead after 3 days. Instead of being hopeful about this, they didn't believe the words of Jesus and thought that the disciples might come to steal the body away from the new tomb and spread a lie that he came alive again. Pilate sent a guard of soldiers and sealed the tomb to prevent any possibility of a rumor like this spreading. For those who have experienced death firsthand, you understand that those still alive keep on living, but they have to figure out how to live without their loved ones. The day after a tragedy can often be more challenging than the day it happened. A word to describe hard days like these is dark. Black Saturday is named so because of the darkness of what had happened that day. Jesus was dead and buried. The disciples were sad and confused, having abandoned him in his time of need. To make matters worse, the women with Jesus weren't even able to prepare his body as they wanted to, since Saturday was the Sabbath. They were left to mourn the death of King Jesus, who 1 week prior was welcomed with palms. So where was Jesus buried? In a new tomb. Today, take some time to read out loud the sad story of Jesus' death and burial in Matthew 27, 57 through 66. Stick around for Pastor Phil Ward as he gives a more in-depth study on Black Saturday.
The Saturday after Good Friday is a mysterious day. We don't know a lot about what happened with the disciples, and there's been much debate on what happened to Jesus from the time he was killed on Good Friday to Resurrection Sunday. And so, because we don't have a lot of information in Scripture, what I want to do is I want to take some time to look at the fact that Jesus predicted 3 separate times that he was going to die and rise from the dead. And I want to look at how his enemies responded to that. And then lastly, we're going to look at how the disciples and his followers were filled with sorrow and grief, the overall mood of what it was like on that Black Saturday. So first, we're going to look at Jesus's predictions. The first one is found in Mark chapter 8, verse 31 to 33. Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said this plainly. But Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Turning and seeing his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." It's an interesting thing what Jesus does. He says plainly, I am going to be arrested, I am going to die, and I'm going to rise from the dead. Peter comes to Jesus and says, you kind of got that one wrong. But Jesus looks over Peter's shoulder, sees his disciples, his other disciples, and for their sake, he rebukes Peter, telling Peter that his mind is not on the things of God. And so that was the first prediction. The second prediction is in Mark chapter 9, verse 30. That they went on from the place they were at, and they passed through Galilee, and Jesus did not want anyone to know where he was at. He was teaching the disciples. He was telling them the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. The response of the disciples was this. They didn't understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him. they saw what Jesus did to Peter, and so they're like, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to ask. And so they just didn't bother. But that was the second time Jesus predicted his death. The third one is in Mark chapter 10, verse 32 to 34. They were going up to Jerusalem. Jesus was walking ahead of his disciples, and they were amazed, and those who followed were also afraid. So you have this mixture of amazement and fear. So Jesus turns to his disciples, and he began to tell them what was going to happen to him. He says, see, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests, the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him, flog him, and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise. So after this third prediction, I have a feeling the disciples kind of understood what was happening. This is serious. Jesus is going to Jerusalem, and some bad things are going to happen to him. Now my question is, what were Jesus' enemies thinking? What were they up to? And so to answer that question, we're going to go to Matthew chapter 27, verse 62 to 66. And what we see is that when Jesus was taken down from the cross, he was prepared for his burial, he was placed in the tomb, and then a stone was rolled over the entrance to the tomb. Watch what happens to Jesus' enemies. It says the next day, which would be the end of Friday, Good Friday, it was the day of preparation. The chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate, and they said, Sir, we remember how this impostor said while he was still alive, that after 3 days he will rise. Therefore order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he has risen from the dead. And the last fraud will be worse than the first. So Pilate said to them, you have a guard of soldiers, go make it as secure as you can. So they went and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard over it. What's amazing about this is the enemies of Jesus knew that Jesus had predicted his death and his resurrection 3 different times. And to try to prevent any funny business from happening, they sent a whole guard to protect the tomb to make sure nothing crazy was happening that would substantiate or confirm Jesus' predictions. But let me go to this one. So we understand what the enemies were thinking, that we got to be careful that his words don't come true. We understand Jesus predicted that this was all going to happen. But how were his disciples thinking, and what were they feeling? Now, to get a feel for what the mood was for the disciples and for everyone on that Black Saturday, we can go to Luke chapter 24, where Jesus is going to have an encounter with 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. So he's walking along and he's listening to them having this conversation. And so he says to them in verse 17 of Luke 24, what is this conversation that you're holding with each other as you walk? And they stood still, looking sad. That's important. They're looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days? And Jesus said to them, what things? And they said to him, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things have happened. And so these disciples were sad. They had their hopes set on Jesus being the Messiah who would deliver the kingdom to Israel, that would expel the Roman occupation. And yet what ends up happening is Jesus dies. Their hopes are dashed. They're living in despair, and they're incredibly, incredibly sad. So you see, Jesus had given 3 predictions: that he was going to Jerusalem to be killed and that he would rise from the dead. Even his enemies knew that to be true. But when you fast forward to the disciples, here they are on Black Saturday. They should know that Resurrection Sunday is coming, but they don't. The Saturday between Good Friday and Resurrection Sunday is called Black Saturday because it's a day of great sadness and sorrow and grief, where the hopes of the people were dashed because they thought Jesus would be this triumphant Messiah, but in reality, he's crucified. They thought that he would be the winner, but now they see his death as a possible great loss. And so for us as Christians, during this Black Saturday, it's a time for us to reflect on what the disciples may have been feeling. They had all their hopes in this Jesus who on Good Friday dies. And then what? What should they expect? What's going to happen now? They didn't have the luxury that we have of knowing that he would rise from the dead. They were sad. They were despairing. They didn't know what was to come. They're in a sense of waiting. I want to give you a couple of thoughts about how they might have felt in this time of waiting. For instance, think of it like this. What if you heard that there was a tragic car accident of somebody that you loved? You didn't know how bad it was. You didn't know whether or not anyone was injured or if there was death. You're just simply waiting to hear the news. Is it good news? Is it bad news? Is it tragic news? We just don't know yet. Or think of it as you have something going on with your body and you go to the doctor and they have to do a biopsy. And then they're going to call you with the results. And you're just sitting there and you're waiting and you're waiting. Is it good news? Is it bad news? Is it tragic news? Or lastly, think of it like somebody waiting for the verdict from a jury. Is it going to be good news? Is it going to be bad news? You just don't know. And so during this Black Saturday, the disciples, they observed the Sabbath. They were probably praying. They were thinking about the things that are happening. They didn't know what would come of it, and they just waited. You can imagine what was going through their minds. Sorrow, uncertainty, anxiety. That is Black Saturday.